VLPSos here. This is a video lesson for Python programming, pass and return. I encourage you to pause and practice on occasion. I'm going to import random at the top of my file to make use of functions in the random module for some examples in this code. I've written a function. The comment that goes with this function is a function that takes no input, you don't pass anything to it, and returns no output. This function is quite simple. It's unsophisticated. Its name is function_1. There are no variables inside of its parentheses, its function parameters, because this function does not expect information or data to be passed to it. It doesn't use any information. It simply prints out 5 lines. It looks like what's printed is a menu of a couple of options. Functions like this would be written to display something to the user, maybe because we would make that display repetitively or many times during the running of the program. So having a function to do that is efficient. Our next example is a little more sophisticated. This is an example of a function that takes input, you pass a value to it, but it returns nothing. We can see that function_2 takes input because in its parentheses we have a variable. So when we call this function, we need to supply some information that will be the value of that variable. And that variable is used in one of the print lines. We could imagine that we have a menu for a player, and the menu is directly addressing the player's name. When we call this function, we would send the player's name to the function, and the function would use it. Our third function is more sophisticated, and the comment says this is a function that takes input and returns something. This is function_3, and like the second function, there is a variable in the parentheses, the argument parameter. So when we call this, we need to send it a value. That value, again, is used in a print line. The menu is within a while loop, and that while loop will continue as long as choice is a string of no length, or there is no choice other than a blank. Choice is reassigned to be input from the user, and we would expect then that the user could be making a choice as a selection on the displayed menu. So if the user chooses something that would be recognized as a menu option in this list of 1, 2, or Q, then the user has made a choice or a valid choice that might do something in the program. And if that's the case, if the user did choose something in the menu, then we have this line of code, return choice. Return is a keyword, and the line of code, if we ran this line of code and got to this place, then the flow of the program, seeing the return, would exit this function. And in exiting, it would send the value of choice to whatever line of code called this function 3. Function 3 is producing a value, and that value that function 3 is producing is returned here, and we would expect that value to represent the user's choice in the menu. The while loop persists if the choice was not valid, and this entire function looks designed to be implemented to continue to show a user some options until a valid option was selected. This is an example of a function that takes input and returns. These functions, if we were to run our program now, do not produce any user output. There's no user experience because the code is entirely within functions that haven't been called. So if we're going to see evidence of these functions being used, we need to call them. the first function, function underscore 1, we can call by its name in empty parentheses because function 1 doesn't take or return anything. If we save and run, that function call will produce this output, which is just simply printing the menu. Function 1 was simple. Calling function 2 requires a name to be sent, or anything we wish, but if we're going to implement the menu as intended, we might want that the value that we send to be the name of a character, like Biff. If I run this example and comment this out briefly, I can see that the second function has been called, and I can see Biff's name, the name that we sent, being used in the print of that menu. But there's no other interactivity. This was the function that we sent information. And the benefit of writing functions is to reuse them. So I can see that I can call function 2 again and simply send another name or another value and take advantage of the function as something that I can use repeatedly, and in the output I can see that the player's name has changed, but I was able to print the menus twice. If I'm going to use function 3, I need to call it by name. It does expect information to be sent to it, so I will supply it. I'm going to comment these two out for the time being. Now function 3, as we've seen, uses the return keyword. It produces a value. Function 3 produces information. But here I've called it just like function 2. And if I ran it, I would have to spell the name correctly to not get an error. If I ran it, I would see just like function 2, function 3 produces a menu. It uses the player's name, in this case Clive, and it expects some input. If I do not give it something that is on the list of menu, or on the list there, I hit an extra key on that last one, then it continues to ask. If I select something like 1 that is in the menu, I can see that my program ended. What happened there was an option was in the list, and so it got to this line of code, and the return meant that we left the function, we exited the function, and we came back to the place that called the function. So the flow of the program, once it got to this line, called function 3. Inside function 3, I gave many choices that weren't acceptable or in the menu, but when I finally did and it got to this line, then I exited the function on the return, and the flow of the program went back to the location that called the function in the first place. And from here, I moved on in my program, but there are no lines below it, so my program quit. Function 3 returned the choice that I had made. It returned a value, but nothing was made of that value. When I returned to this line of code and moved on, the value of choice was forgotten. It didn't cause an error, but there is no benefit or use that I wrote in my program to make use of the fact that function 3 returned a value. Now I could allow that value that is returned to be assigned to be the value of a variable. In this case, if I add any variable name, I could repeat and use the word choice. If I assign a variable to be equal to a call to a function, and the function returns a value, then when I return to this location after using the function, the value that is returned will be assigned to be the value of that variable. If that's the case, then I ought to be able to print right here the value of choice, which will be what I chose and was returned. Let's see if that works. Current player Clive, if I give it something that it is not in the menu, like 5, I'm still in the menu, but if I give it something like 2, I exit the menu, I return to the place that called the menu function. That value that was returned became the value of choice, so when I printed it, it became 2, or I saw my selection as 2. Uncommenting these so that we can see them run again if we wished, and moving on. Let's see this idea of returning again. Reading the comment, let's see another function that takes input that must be passed through its argument parameters, parentheses, and returns output that must be assigned to a variable so that it may be used. This function will also have no user interactivity, which means no print and no input within the function. That function has been defined. It's called value counter. We do pass information to this vowel counter function. Message is the variable that will represent the information passed to this function when we use it. The function defines a variable called count and sets it equal to 0. Then it uses a for loop to iterate through the message, which was the value that was sent to this function. And for each element or letter in that message, it lowers it and looks to see if it's in a list of vowels. And if it is in a list of values, then it will increment or add 1 to count. After the for loop is terminated, it returns count. What this means is, if we send it a message like a string, a sentence, it will go through each letter of the sentence, and every time it finds a value, it will increase the value of count. So what's happening is the vowels in the string are being counted. And as soon as the process is done counting, the total amount of vowels that was counted is returned as information that this function produced. How that information is used is up to the programmer that uses this function. To test this, we can first define a variable or assign a variable to be input from the user with a prompt, enter a string. Once we get the string, we want to call the vowel counter function and send the string that we just got as input to it. So we do that by a call to vowel counter, sending a string, which we got from the user. Now, this will work, but if the vowel counter function returns a value, and it does, it will return the count, the number of vowels that were counted. That information, once it will return to this line of code. And that information will be lost unless we assign it to a variable. So I'm going to set the variable vowels equal to the call of this function. So now when the value of count is returned, it returns here, and then becomes the value of vowels. We can see the evidence of this in a print statement. There were, and we expect it to be an integer, vowels in that string, and supply the integer value with the value of vowels. Let's save and run, but comment this block out from previous examples. Enter a string. We sent the string, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, all full of spaces as well. And we must have counted the vowels, and what was returned was the value 11 that became then that integer that was printed in that line. Passing and returning to functions takes some practice. It's a very powerful technique. We will write functions that we can pass and return information to all the time. Now you. You have seen a few functions that can handle input and produce output. Write one of your own that performs a task with no user interactivity and demonstrate its use. No user interactivity means writing a function that performs a task without printing or getting input from the user. It's a function of utility. Try it and have fun.